There's a particular kind of exhaustion that no one talks about. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, the exhaustion of thinking too clearly. Most people assume that a sharp analytical mind is an unconditional advantage. They imagine the deep thinker moving through the world with confidence, reading situations faster, making better decisions, staying 10 steps ahead. What they don't see is the private cost of that clarity, the way it quietly dismantles experiences before they can be fully felt, the way it turns a perfectly good moment into a problem to be solved. This isn't a flaw, it is an adaptation. And like most adaptations, it comes with a shadow side that takes years to recognize. If your mind never fully powers down, if you find yourself analyzing conversations after they end, deconstructing your own emotional responses while you are still inside them, noticing the cracks in things most people simply enjoy, this may be one of the most honest examinations of what that actually costs you and why it developed in the first place. The mind that cannot stop analyzing does not do so out of dysfunction. It does so because at some point, analysis kept it safe. Clinical psychology consistently observes that individuals who develop strong pattern recognition tendencies often do so as an early survival response. Environments that were unpredictable, emotionally inconsistent, or intellectually understimulating condition the brain to stay alert, to scan, to find the flaw before the flaw finds you. What begins as protection slowly becomes personality, and what becomes personality eventually becomes invisible. You stop noticing you're doing it because it has always simply been how you experience the world. The specific cruelty of this pattern is what it does to joy. Psychologists frequently encounter a phenomenon where high analytical individuals report emotional experiences as somehow incomplete. Not absent, incomplete. They feel the beginning of happiness, they feel the early warmth of a meaningful connection, and then something internal shifts from experiencing to examining, and the feeling begins to dissolve under its own scrutiny. Not because the emotion wasn't real, because the mind moved in too fast.
This is not overthinking in the casual, self-deprecating sense people use at dinner parties. This is the brain treating emotional experience the same way it treats intellectual problems, as something to be understood rather than inhabited. And the tragic irony is that understanding an emotion and feeling it are not the same process. They require opposite orientations. One demands distance, the other demands presence. There's a biological dimension to this that deserves to be said plainly. The phrase "ignorance is bliss" is not a dismissal of intelligence. It is an accurate description of what selective inattention allows. People who do not scrutinize their happiness are not less intelligent. They are, in some neurological sense, less activated. The analytical mind carries a higher baseline of internal noise. It generates more associations, more contingencies, more potential failure points per unit of experience. This is not weakness, it is a form of cognitive hypervigilance that, once installed, operates without permission. Before we continue, take a moment and actually write these points down. Not because you'll forget the ideas, but because the act of writing engages a different kind of processing, slower, more deliberate, and that matters for a mind that moves as quickly as yours likely does. And if this kind of psychological precision is what you come here for, consider liking the video and subscribing, because we make these specifically for people who are tired of being handed surface-level explanations. Share it with someone who might quietly recognize themselves in it. Drop a comment with what you're noticing. We build future videos directly from what you bring to us. Now, the standards. Psychology shows that high analytical individuals do not simply set high standards because they're ambitious. They set them because their minds are genuinely capable of envisioning the optimal version of almost any outcome. The gap between what exists and what could theoretically exist is not imagined, it is accurately perceived. This is the burden of potential. You are not making things harder than they need to be. You are seeing quite clearly how much better something could be. And that vision becomes the baseline against which all actual outcomes are measured.
The result is a relationship with achievement that most people around you cannot understand. Every accomplishment functions as temporary relief rather than lasting satisfaction. You reach the goal, the internal pressure lifts briefly, and then, almost immediately, the mind recalibrates, identifies the next gap, and the quiet dissatisfaction returns. This is not ingratitude. This is the logical consequence of a mind that cannot stop generating higher resolution versions of the possible. Therapeutic practice often reveals something deeper underneath this pattern, a belief, rarely articulated, that the relief will finally be permanent once the right threshold is crossed. Once the career reaches a certain level, once the relationship reaches a certain depth, once the mind is finally satisfied. But the threshold moves. It is always moved. Because the mind generating the standard is the same mind that will immediately generate the next one upon arrival. This creates a particular kind of external friction that is worth naming honestly. When your internal logic operates at a certain level of precision, the world outside begins to feel epistemically offensive. Not because other people are less intelligent, but because most human social behavior is not organized around logical precision. It is organized around comfort, familiarity, ego protection, and emotional momentum. When you expect the world to behave the way your internal reasoning does, the collision is not occasional, it is constant. Research indicates that individuals with high analytical tendencies report significantly higher rates of social frustration, not from disliking people, but from a specific exhaustion that comes from translating between internal and external logic systems all day. Every conversation requires a kind of cognitive code switching that most people never have to perform. You are not antisocial. You are running a more expensive social process. This is where isolation enters. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but as a slow and quiet accumulation. The struggle with prioritizing factual accuracy over social harmony is not simply a communication style. It is a values conflict that runs deep. To soften of a true thing for the sake of someone's comfort requires a small but genuine act of self-betrayal. For most analytical minds, this is not a cost they can absorb indefinitely without consequences. And yet, the alternative, speaking with full precision, consistently disrupts social spaces that depend on a certain level of shared fiction to function smoothly. The result is a peculiar form of loneliness. Not the loneliness of someone who wants connection and cannot find it. The loneliness of someone who finds the available forms of connection persistently inadequate to their actual interior. Deep thinkers often describe feeling like observers of human interaction, watching the patterns, understanding the dynamics, but unable to fully dissolve into the experience the way others seem to. This is not superiority, it is alienation. And alienation that is misread as superiority becomes one of the most isolating experiences available to a human being. Small talk in this context is not merely boring, it is structurally incompatible. The analytical mind brings a significant amount of processing power to every interaction. It tracks subtext, evaluates consistency, identifies underlying motivations, and monitors its own responses simultaneously. To deploy that entire apparatus in service of a conversation about the weather is not just tedious, it feels like a waste of a limited internal resource, which, cognitively speaking, it is. The patterns you repeat today quietly shape the boundaries of your inner world. And perhaps no pattern is more quietly consequential than the relationship between analytical depth and decision-making. An abundance of data points does not produce clarity, it produces paralysis. This is one of the more counterintuitive findings in psychological research on decision-making, and it maps precisely onto the experience of the analytical mind. The capacity to simulate outcomes, to run mental projections of how a given decision might unfold across multiple variables, is powerful. It is also exhausting. And when every possible path comes with an accurately perceived set of risks, the safest psychological move is often to remain still. This is not cowardice, it is the rational conclusion of a mind that has modeled the terrain and found it genuinely complex. but it carries a cost that accumulates quietly over years. The decisions not made, the paths not taken, the experiences bypassed in favor of further analysis. Mental fatigue from simulating negative outcomes before taking a single step is a real and underappreciated phenomenon. The body remains in one place while the mind travels through dozens of potential futures and returns tired. The deepest irony is that the ability to see 10 moves ahead, which feels like strategic intelligence, often prevents full engagement with the move currently underway. You are playing the game while simultaneously analyzing it, and the analysis consistently pulls attention out of the present moment before the present moment has finished offering what it had to give. Psychologists frequently observe that this pattern, left unexamined, compounds over time. Each bypassed experience represents not just a moment missed, but an internal confirmation that the world is best navigated through thought rather than engagement, that presence is risky, that allowing something to simply be experienced without evaluation is a form of vulnerability the mind has not yet decided to permit. This is where the cost becomes existential, not in a dramatic sense, in a quiet, structural sense. A life organized primarily around analysis is a life in which the ratio of thinking about living to actually living gradually tilts in one direction. The existential cost is not suffering, it is distance from your own experience, from the texture of moments, from other people, from yourself. And here is where the psychology becomes genuinely interesting, because the solution that presents itself, think more carefully about the problem of thinking too much, is the trap. What therapeutic practice consistently points toward is not the elimination of analytical capacity, but the cultivation of a different relationship with it. The shift from solving life to experiencing it does not require abandoning intelligence. It requires assigning it a different role. One of the most consistent findings in mindfulness research is that physical grounding, deliberate attention to sensory experience, does not reduce cognitive sharpness. It temporarily suspends the evaluative function, allowing experience to register before the mind converts it into data. This is not self-help language. This is a neurological reality. The evaluative cortical processes that drive analysis can be temporarily quieted by sustained attention to immediate sensory input. The mind cannot fully analyze what it is fully inhabiting, which means the path back to felt experience runs through the body, not around it. The other dimension that clinical psychology consistently identifies is the importance of intellectual peers, not as a social luxury, but as a psychological necessity for certain minds. The sense of being an observer of human connection, rather than a participant in it, often recedes significantly in the presence of people who share the same cognitive frequency. This is not about finding people who agree with you. It is about finding people with whom the translation cost disappears, where you do not need to simplify, calibrate, or manage the precision of your thinking in real time. For some minds, this kind of connection is the first experience of social belonging that feels fully real. The final realization, the one that tends to arrive quietly, not as insight but as recognition, is this. The analytical mind was built for a reason. The hypervigilance, the pattern recognition, the inability to simply accept things at surface value, these emerged from somewhere. They served a function. They kept something intact at a time when something needed keeping. The question worth sitting with is not how to dismantle what was built. It is whether the conditions that required its construction still exist, whether the analysis is still protecting something real, or whether it has become a reflex running without an original threat, whether the standards, the isolation, the paralysis, whether these are still adaptive, or whether they have become the very thing that makes genuine experience inaccessible. That question cannot be answered through more analysis. It can only be answered through the kind of honest, sustained attention to one's own interior that most analytical minds find more difficult than any intellectual problem they have ever encountered. Because finally turning the precision inward, not to evaluate, not to solve, but simply to see, requires a courage that no amount of intelligence automatically provides. If this perspective reached something in you, consider liking the video. Subscribe for more psychologically precise explorations like this. We do not do surface here. Share it with someone who might quietly recognize themselves in it. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. There is more of this kind of depth waiting for you.